It was the most amazing thing. As for Johnny the hand puppet, Mr. Senior Wences would he was smoking a cigarette. He'd have his hand puppet take a drag on the cigarette, and then he would have Johnny blow perfect smoke rings. Other ventriloquists and magicians couldn't figure out how he did it. Well, I tell you, I was saddened, and I'm sure many of Senior Wences's fans were saddened to learn last April that Senior Wences had died at the age of 103. But I was thinking that during his last days, Senior Wences would be able to look back on his 103 years of life, of which he devoted 7 or 8 decades to making people smile without offending anybody, without embarrassing anybody, and he could look back with satisfaction and he could say, it's all right. Senior Wences. We're going to go back now to 1971. In the early days of Those Were the Days for Chuck Shaden, and one of his earlier interviews, he was interviewing actor Vincent Price here in Chicago, talking about radio. Vincent Price died in 1993 at the age of 82. He was 60 when this interview was recorded. Chuck told me privately that Vincent Price was in town to promote something he was doing for Sears. I think he was the art consultant for art that Sears Roebuck was selling. And Chuck, to his credit, thought that he should ask Vincent Price something about his relationship with Sears. That's the reason for his tour. And to Vincent Price's credit, he said, "No, I'd rather talk about radio." So here are Vincent Price and Chuck Shaden talking about radio in 1971.
Our guest today is a man who is respected as one of the country's leading art experts and as one of our leading actors, too. His characterizations and scores of spine-tingling dramas has left audiences gasping around the world. And many of our good old radio listeners will remember him from appearances in dozens and dozens of radio anthology series as well. In one radio series, he was Simon Templar, the Robin Hood of modern crime, playing a saint rather than a sinner. He's Vincent Price. Welcome, Mr. Price, to Those Were the Days.
How are you?
I'm fine.
I'm delighted to be here. I love to talk about radio.
Well, great. We're going to zero in on radio then for a little while today. You know, people tend to associate you always with the horror films you've made and forget, perhaps, so much that you've done on radio and also some of the things you've done in motion pictures that really weren't at all related to the horror films, especially when I remember when so many of the films you made for 20th Century Fox in I guess it was about early 1940s or something.
Well, 1940s and 50s. Actually, I never did a horror film until about 1955, and I did one called The House of Wax, which was a tremendous success, and I've done a few since then, but out of the 100 films I've done, only about 20 of them have been horror films. The ones I like to remember, which fortunately are still on television, are some of the ones I did at Fox, like Laura and Song of Bernadette and Keys of the Kingdom, those pictures.
You may not have actually been in what is called a horror film in some of the early pictures that you did, but many of them were spooky films or scary pictures, things like...
They were really more melodramas, some of them, yeah. And the first one I did really was not in the movies, but in the theater. I did a play that was a very famous play and ran forever in New York called Angel Street, which was about a fellow who tried to drive his wife mad, and it was a very exciting play.
The film was Gaslight.
Gaslight, that's right.
Before you started your motion picture career, you were quite an established actor on the stage.
Yes, I did a play with Helen Hayes, which ran for 3 years in New York, and then Angel Street ran a couple of years, and I did a lot of plays with Orson Welles in the Mercury Theater, and I still do a lot of theater.
You do?
Yeah, I try to do one every year. Last year I did Oliver, the musical. Had a wonderful time doing that.
Gee, well, I hope that your stage roles will bring you to Chicago one day so we can get a chance to see you on the board, so to speak.
I was asked to do Sleuth here, as a matter of fact, and it's one of the most exciting plays I've ever seen. I think you all will love it here.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing you.
No, I can't do it, unfortunately. I've got a commitment to do a film.
Well, there's another year.
Yeah.
Another year and
Another play.
Another play. You mentioned House of Wax a moment ago. That actually was a remake of an old Lionel Atwill
That's
film.
right.
I think it was called The Mystery of the
Wax Museum. And then they called it, in my version, which was in 3D, The House of Wax. And actually, it was one of the biggest money makers of all time. That gimmick with the glasses and everything really caught hold. And unfortunately, it was uncomfortable for people to wear the glasses, so 3D went out.
But you know, it was amazingly. I've seen the film since seeing it in the theater in 3D. I've seen it on television many times.
Yeah.
And the impact of the film was not lost just because you lose the 3D.
No, it really wasn't. One of the reasons, I think, was that the director, André de Toth, didn't make it just for the gimmicks. You know, he made it as a very, very good film. And consequently, when you see it without 3D, it's just as good.
But the best 3D effect in it was the fellow with the
ping pong ball.
The ping pong.
Yes, it was marvelous. Yeah,
that was really, really something. Your latest film is Dr. Phibes, and you've got a sequel coming up.
Yes, I don't know what they're going to call it yet. Dr. Phibes really sort of calls for a sequel. There are few films that do, but it really does, because there was one thing left undone in this film. You know, I'd like to get back to radio, because
so would I.
I think that radio was probably one of the most exciting medias that ever was. The audience had to do a lot of work. I did a great many Suspense and Escape and all of those theaters, radio theaters. And the audience really had to build the sets, to create the makeup, to figure out what they thought the people were like, what the ambiance of the drama was like. It was terribly exciting. And almost everybody that I've ever known who started in the theater, who has made a success in the theater, started in radio. Radio was the greatest training ground for actors, I think, that ever was.
Did you get involved in radio through Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air?
No, I was with Orson before the Mercury Theater on the Air. I did a lot of soap operas when I was playing in plays in New York. It was a way of training, really. I mean, you'd go in and you'd do these things, John's other wife and Sam's other mother, and, you know, they were marvelous fun, though, and they called for a kind of immediate, almost improvisation that was very exciting. Everybody I know really feels that radio was one of the great dramatic mediums.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And when we hear today some of the programs that were produced for radio 25 and 30 years ago, they still hold up. They stand up very well.
I did one called Three Skeleton Key, about three men who were trapped in a lighthouse when the rats invaded this little island. That still is one of the most exciting shows, I think, that I've ever done in my life. It was just tremendously thrilling.
You used your radio skills, if that's what we can call them. You used your acting skills on radio, I should say, many, many times, and you appeared quite frequently on Screen Guild Players program and the Philip Morris Playhouse, too. I think you were involved.
I did 10 of those with Tallulah Bankhead. They were kind of an experience, I'll tell you.
Working with Tallulah?
Yeah, she was marvelous. She really was. I had the greatest admiration for this woman.
And you played a continuing character for a while in The Saint.
Yes, for 3 years I did The Saint. Yeah. It was a challenge that I wanted very much at that point in my career, to try and create somebody, you know, I mean, completely. I'm not really that interested in doing that kind of a thing in television. The Saint had a lot more dimensions than you're allowed in television as a character. You're visual, and therefore you're limited, but in a radio drama, you can create anything you want. And it has more excitement, really, as an acting medium.
And all you have to do is blink your eyes to change the set, as you say.
That's right, absolutely.
Which was, when exactly did you get involved in radio? What point was it? Was it 39 or 40? Or
well, I started in the theater in 1935, and I started in London, though I'm an American. But I did some radio over there, and radio is still a very, very big medium in England. The BBC does brilliant dramas and marvelous music and dramatizations of the lives of different people, as they have done recently on television. And then I came over here and went in the theater, and I felt that I needed radio as an extension. And I started right away, about 1937, doing radio.
Mm-hmm. And you've actually been associated with radio right up until I guess most of the time that you had that was extra was spent on television. Then.
Yes, and I still do radio. I every chance I get. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, now it's cut down to a place where you really don't have time to do it. There are too many commercials. And I remember during the time that radio was sort of drifting out and television was drifting in Hollywood, we would do remakes of the great shows that we had done in the great days of radio. And they would be cut so and interfered so by the commercial that they lost their impact. Because radio has a continuity that is just marvelous, as a play does, 3 acts. I miss it very much.
What is there really anything going on in radio today as far as drama is concerned?
No. There's just 48 hours of news every 24.
If someone were to come up, I asked this of many of our guests who fondly remember radio as you do. If someone came up with a good Playhouse on the air again today, 2 questions. Do you think that it would go? Do you think it would be accepted by the large listening audience today? And secondly, would you like to be a part of it?
I would like to be a part of it, first of all. I'm not sure it would. I think that people now are visually oriented and have been a bit visually put upon. I don't think television has really lived up to its promise. It could be one of the great medias of all time because it's got voice and it's got picture and it's got everything going for it. But so much of the programming is really so inferior, and they don't do anything about education. When we did the CBS workshop and things like that in radio, we dramatized all the great novels. I would do plays with Ruth Gordon and people like this, and we'd do Ibsen and Shakespeare, and there was this marvelous thing of the audience being a captive audience by their own volition. And I don't know whether you could do that anymore. I mean, we're oriented now to turning on the radio to find out whether the freeway is jammed. I don't know whether people would really listen. I would, but I'm not sure.
We play large slices of good old radio every week on this show. And we've found that people do listen and enjoy the vintage radio programs again. Most generally, the reaction is it's very difficult the first time we hear 1 or 2 of these shows because we're trained not to use the imagination. But if you stick with it for a couple of hours, not necessarily all at once, those imagination buds start working again.
Absolutely. I think, people like Jack Benny, I did several shows with Jack, both on TV and radio, but I always felt that he was one of the great radio people, and I don't think he ever really lived up to it as much in television. There was a magic about that voice and the pauses and everything he did.
Well, the
so
vault, his vault, for
example.
Oh, yes,
it was marvelous. You never could picture it.
No.
Never
could recreate it
on
TV. You're in Chicago this week to herald the opening of another Vincent Price Sears Art Gallery? Is that
No, actually, Sears is a very adventurous company. They feel an obligation towards their enormous public, and they have the public. And they're starting a home decorating school, which they